It was August 1966, and the hills surrounding Rio de Janeiro were suffocated by a dense tropical mist that swallowed the landscape whole. To the outside world, Brazil was moving through a period of intense, rapid modernization. Urban centers were growing, technology was advancing, and the cultural fabric of the nation was shifting. But on the other side of the bay, from the energy and bustle of Rio, in the municipality of Niterói, a very different atmosphere reigned. Here, the geography was defined by sharp elevations and thick, untamed vegetation. Among these peaks stood Morro do Vintém, known to locals as Vintém Hill. It was a steep, craggy rise, a place largely cut off from the rhythms of daily city life. The terrain was notoriously difficult to navigate, covered in dense thickets of tall grass, loose soil, and jagged rock formations. For the most part, people avoided it. It was an isolated island of wilderness where the constant hum of urban traffic slowly faded away, replaced only by the rustle of dry leaves and the persistent, eerie whistling of the Atlantic winds pushing through the valleys. On the afternoon of August 20, 1966, the absolute silence of Vintém Hill was broken by the footsteps of an 18-year-old local boy named Jorge da Costa Alves. It was a typical overcast afternoon, and Jorge was doing what many boys his age did. He was flying a kite. When the wind caught the line and snapped it, the kite drifted away, sailing over the crest of the hill and descending into the thick, overgrown brush on the upper slopes. Jorge was familiar with the lower paths, but tracking a lost object meant pushing deep into areas where no established trails existed. He spent an hour hacking his way through the dense vegetation, climbing higher onto a natural, secluded ledge of the mountain. As he pushed aside a particularly thick wall of tall elephant grass, he suddenly stopped. The air in the clearing felt unusually heavy, completely devoid of the mountain breeze. Resting on the damp earth directly ahead of him were two human figures. At first glance, Jorge assumed they were two men simply resting after a long hike, perhaps sleeping off the effects of a long day. But as he took a cautious step forward, a profound sense of unease took hold. The absolute immobility of the bodies was wrong. There was no rise and fall of their chests, no shifting of their limbs, and no sound of breathing. They were laid out neatly, side by side, completely rigid. The realization of what he was looking at hit him all at once. Terrified, the young boy spun around and scrambled back down the treacherous, muddy slope. He didn't stop running until he reached the concrete streets of Niterói, rushing directly into the local police precinct to report the grim discovery. The sun was already slipping below the horizon by the time Jorge finished his statement. Because of the rugged, vertical nature of Vintém Hill and the complete lack of lighting, the police chief determined that a recovery mission in the pitch darkness was too dangerous for his men. The brush was too thick, the cliffs too steep. The clearing would have to wait. The following morning, on August 21st, a formal task force was assembled. Investigators, forensic technicians, firefighters, and a handful of local journalists began the grueling trek up the mountain, hacking through the undergrowth with machetes to retrace the boys' steps. The detectives expected to find a standard crime scene. In the mid-1960s, bodies found in isolated areas were almost always the result of localized gang violence, political retributions, or perhaps a tragic joint suicide pact. They were prepared for a routine investigation. What they actually found when they stepped onto that remote ledge completely defied everything they had been trained to look for. It was a scene so perfectly orchestrated yet so utterly inexplicable that it would instantly become one of the most baffling mysteries in the history of global forensics. The two bodies lay perfectly parallel to one another, positioned flat on their backs on a bed of leaves that appeared to have been neatly cut and arranged beforehand. There were absolutely no signs of a physical struggle. The surrounding soil was undisturbed, the tall grass wasn't trampled, and there were no defensive wounds or marks of violence on either man. What struck the investigators immediately was their attire. They were completely unsuited for a treacherous climb up a muddy, rain-slicked hill. Both men were dressed in high-quality, formal business attire, immaculate suits, crisp white dress shirts, polished shoes, and carefully knotted ties. Over these formal clothes, they wore identical, bright green waterproof raincoats. It looked as though they had prepared for an important business meeting or a formal event, rather than an expedition into the wilderness, but the clothing was nothing compared to the shock that awaited investigators when they approached the faces of the deceased. Resting squarely over the eyes of both men were crude, homemade masks forged from heavy sheet lead. These were not manufactured safety goggles or industrial equipment. They were hand-cut oval plates of dull, toxic metal, crudely hammered and bent slightly at the bridge to fit over the nose. They possessed no eye holes, no slits, and no punctures of any kind. To place these masks over one's eyes meant to completely cut off the visual world, plunging the wearer into absolute impenetrable darkness. Why would two grown men travel a massive distance, scale an isolated peak in expensive suits, don heavy raincoats in the heat, and intentionally blind themselves with toxic metal plates? The investigators began meticulously cataloguing the clearing, searching for clues that might explain the bizarre tableau. Beside the parallel bodies resting neatly on the grass were three items: an empty plastic bottle that had previously contained commercial mineral water, a small clean white towel, and a pocket notebook. The notebook belonged to one of the men. As the lead detective carefully flipped through the pages, he found rows of complex technical equations, schematics for electronic components, and notes regarding radio frequencies. But when he reached a specific page toward the middle, the handwriting changed from technical notations to a steady, blocky script. It was a short, chilling checklist written in Portuguese. The text read exactly: 1630, estar no local determinado. 1830, ingerir cápsula. Após efeito proteger metais aguardar sinal mascara. When translated into English, the words revealed a terrifyingly cold, step-by-step timeline. 1630, be at the agreed place. 1830, swallow capsule. After effect, protect metals, wait for signal mask. The note was an administrative guide to their own demise. It raised an immediate wall of questions that the police could not answer. Who had determined this specific location on Vintém Hill? What was the nature of the capsule they were instructed to ingest? What did it mean to protect metals? And what was the mysterious signal they were supposed to wait for while trapped in total blindness behind plates of lead? To begin unlocking this puzzle, the authorities had to look beyond Niterói. They needed to find out who these men were, and to do that, they had to trace the final 72 hours of their lives. Identification documents in their pockets revealed their names: Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They were not locals from Niterói or Rio de Janeiro. They were professional electronic technicians who lived and worked in the city of Campos dos Goytacazes, a commercial hub located roughly 170 miles to the north. In their hometown they were respected, rational men. They ran a successful repair shop, fixing radios, early television sets, and complex electrical appliances. They were known for their analytical minds, their understanding of physics, and their technical competence. They were married, family men with deep roots in their community. Nothing in their public profiles suggested instability or a desire to vanish. The journey that led them to the ledge began on the morning of Wednesday, August 17, 1966. Miguel and Manuel packed their things and told their respective families that they were taking a bus out of town. The official reason for the trip was twofold. They claimed they were traveling to Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro to purchase a second-hand car for their business, and they needed to source a batch of rare, high-quality electronic components that were unavailable in their local market. Manuel's wife would later provide a crucial detail to investigators. Before leaving the house, her husband had assembled a massive amount of cash, totaling approximately 2.3 million cruzeiros. It was a fortune at the time, safely tucked away inside his clothing. They boarded an interstate bus, but instead of heading to the major automotive markets of Sao Paulo, they purchased tickets directly to Niterói, arriving at the main bus terminal at approximately 2:30 p.m. From the very moment they stepped off the transport, witnesses who interacted with them described their behavior as highly unusual. They did not behave like casual businessmen or tourists looking for a vehicle. Instead, they moved through the city streets with an intense, rigid focus, as if they were operating under a strict, unyielding countdown. Within minutes of leaving the terminal, the two technicians entered a local electronic supply shop, but they didn't ask for the specialized components they had allegedly traveled to find. Instead, they walked through the aisles, whispered to one another in low, hurried tones, and left without purchasing a single item. Their next stop was a clothing retail store just down the street. It was here that they bought the two identical, bright green waterproof raincoats. The purchase was notable because the afternoon weather, while overcast, was warm and humid. There was no immediate indication of a severe storm that would warrant such heavy, suffocating protective gear. By 3:15 p.m. the men walked into a small, local bar and restaurant to seek shelter from a light drizzle that had begun to fall. The waitress who took their order, a woman named Renata, would later become one of the most vital witnesses in the entire investigation. When questioned by detectives, Renata recalled the two men with absolute clarity. She stated that they seemed completely consumed by anxiety. They sat at the table in absolute silence, barely speaking to one another. One of them, matching the physical description of Miguel, kept shifting in his seat, his eyes darting toward the door. Every few minutes he would lift his wrist, staring intently at his watch, his fingers visibly trembling as he checked the time. They didn't order food. They simply requested a single bottle of commercial mineral water. When the bill arrived, they paid immediately, but they did something highly specific. They insisted that Renata provide them with an official, itemized receipt for the water. It was a bizarre, pedantic request for men who were about to march into the wilderness, suggesting that even on the brink of whatever awaited them, they felt a compulsive need to document their financial transactions. After stepping out of the bar into the damp afternoon air, the clear trail of their movements suddenly shattered. The timeline in the notebook stated that they had to be at the determined location by 4:30 p.m. A few local residents near the base of Vintém Hill reported seeing two men in formal suits boarding a local jeep transport that operated as a makeshift taxi service heading toward the mountain's base. The geography and timing aligned perfectly. As a cold, steady rain began to blanket the region, Miguel and Manuel walked past the final perimeter of residential houses, stepped off the paved road, and began their final ascent into the thick, dark brush of the mountain. They carried nothing but a small towel, a bottle of water, their notebook, and the hidden sheets of lead. They were never seen alive again. When the details of the crime scene and the contents of the notebook were published by the Brazilian press, a wave of intense public fascination swept the country. The mid-1960s was an era defined by a massive global obsession with space exploration, the Cold War, and the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Brazil, in particular, was experiencing a massive surge in alternative spiritual movements, esoteric cults, and amateur scientific societies that attempted to merge the occult with modern radio technology. The public did not see a standard double murder. They saw a gateway into the unknown. As detectives from Niterói traveled north to search the workshop and private residences of Miguel and Manuel in Campos, they quickly realized that the victims led a double life. On the surface, they were traditional, logical electronics repairmen. But behind closed doors, they were deeply embedded in a secretive, underground subculture of spiritualism, cosmic experimentation, and alternative physics. They were men obsessed with the idea that the human mind, aided by technology, could pierce the veil of normal human perception. In the backyard of Manuel's home, investigators discovered a highly irregular laboratory setup that shocked the local community. Hidden from view was a collection of bizarre electronic apparatus, massive copper coils, heavy antenna arrays stretched across the property lines, and a large, homemade sphere constructed from solid concrete. Neighbors were brought in for questioning, and they painted a picture of late-night operations that had been going on for years. They reported that Miguel, Manuel, and a third close associate named Elcio Gomes were frequently seen huddled around high-frequency radio transmitters in the dead of night, tuning dials and listening to the rhythmic hiss of shortwave static. They weren't merely trying to pick up international radio broadcasts. Their personal logs and journals revealed a much grander, more dangerous ambition. They believed they could construct a specialized device capable of intercepting communication signals that did not originate from this planet. They were attempting to contact extraterrestrial intelligence and spiritual entities existing on alternate dimensional frequencies. Their belief system was a complex hybrid of spiritual mediumship and space-age radio science. They operated under the assumption that spiritual beings were composed of high-frequency energy, and that by tuning a physical radio transmitter to the exact cosmic resonant frequency, they could bridge the gap between life and death, between Earth and the cosmos. As the search widened, authorities discovered that the fateful trip to Vintém Hill was not their first dangerous experiment. Just a year earlier, in 1965, the trio had traveled to a remote stretch of beach in the area of Atafona. There they had constructed a massive, highly unstable electronic device connected to a series of heavy batteries. The experiment ended in disaster. The device overloaded, triggering a massive explosion that shattered windows across the nearby coastline and drew the immediate intervention of local military security forces. When questioned at the time, the men claimed it was a simple radio anomaly, but their private records indicated it was a failed attempt to tear open an energy field, a physical doorway that would allow otherworldly forces to manifest in our reality. In these esoteric circles, lead held a highly specific, ritualistic significance. The journals found in the workshop contained references to the vulnerability of the human organism when exposed to raw spiritual energy or intense extraterrestrial radiation. The subculture believed that when an entity manifested, or when the human mind elevated to an alternate frequency, it would be accompanied by a blinding, lethal light capable of causing permanent madness or physical death. The lead masks, therefore, were revealed to be a form of crude, homemade armor. They were designed as a total sensory deprivation tool, meant to shield the physical eyes from a cosmic illumination, forcing the consciousness to look entirely inward while the brain adapted to a new wavelength of reality. This paranormal narrative, which many traditional detectives initially dismissed as wild speculation, suddenly gained massive official weight when the police began interviewing residents who lived directly at the base of Morro do Vintém. They were looking for suspicious individuals or vehicles, but what they uncovered was an independent sighting that sent shockwaves through the department. A local housewife named Gracinda Barbosa Coutinho de Souza was brought in for a formal interview. She testified under oath that on the night of Wednesday, August 17th, the exact night forensic teams estimated that Miguel and Manuel lost their lives, she was driving past the base of the hill with her children. It was a dark, rainy evening, and as she looked up toward the isolated summit of Vintém Hill, she saw something that caused her to slam on the brakes. Hovering directly over the steep ledge where the bodies would later be found was a massive, vibrant, glowing orange object. Gracinda described the object as completely round, emitting a strange, rhythmic, pulsing light that cast long, shifting shadows across the dark slopes of the mountain. She and her children watched in absolute silence as the craft hovered completely motionless for several minutes, seemingly unaffected by the heavy winds and rain. Then, without warning, the object shot vertically into the night sky, vanishing into the upper atmosphere without producing a single sound. Police records would later reveal that several other independent witnesses across Niterói reported seeing identical strange lights in the sky on that very same night. The case had transformed from a local forensic puzzle into a national mystery that gripped the front pages of every newspaper in South America. While the public and the media debated the existence of flying saucers and secret cults, the Niterói Police Department attempted to anchor the investigation back to cold, hard science. The instructions in the notebook were explicit: swallow capsule. If the authorities could determine exactly what chemical compound was inside those capsules, they could understand how the men died, who had supplied the substance, and whether this was a case of mutual suicide, accidental self-poisoning, or a calculated murder. The key to the entire mystery lay inside the bodies on the steel tables of the medical examiner. But it was at this exact moment that the forensic investigation ground to a total, catastrophic halt, because the bodies had lain on the humid, rain-slicked ledge of the hill for nearly 4 days before Jorge found them. Natural decomposition was extremely advanced. The conditions on Vintém Hill had acted like a natural incubator, rapidly breaking down organic tissue. To make matters worse, the local morgue in Niteroi was severely underfunded and lacked the advanced equipment necessary for complex chemical analysis. The medical examiner was completely overwhelmed by a massive backlog of cases. By the time the internal organs were finally extracted and sent to a specialized laboratory for toxicology screening, the results were an absolute disaster. The official lab report came back with a single, frustrating word: inconclusive. The standard tests of 1966 could find no trace of common poisons like arsenic, cyanide, or heavy sedatives. However, because the vital organs had deteriorated so severely, the chemical structural integrity of whatever substance they had ingested had completely vanished, melting away into the organic breakdown. The medical examiner could not state with scientific certainty what killed Manuel and Miguel. There were no marks on their necks, no foreign objects in their airways, and no structural damage to their skulls. Their hearts had simply ceased to beat at some point in the darkness of August 17th. Furthermore, a massive financial anomaly turned the investigation back toward a theory of a grounded human crime. The massive sum of 2.3 million cruzeros that Manuel had packed into his clothing before leaving Campos was completely gone. When investigators searched the pockets of the waterproof raincoats, they found only a few small notes of local currency, barely enough to pay for a meal. The fortune had vanished. This discovery gave rise to a powerful counter-theory, the mechanics of a cold-blooded robbery. Detectives began to speculate that Miguel and Manuel had not been alone on that hill. They hypothesized that a third party, someone who was fully aware of their naive belief in the occult and their desperate desire to contact extraterrestrial life, had meticulously set a trap. This individual could have convinced the two technicians that a high-level cosmic encounter could be arranged on Vintém Hill, but that it required a massive financial tribute or cash exchange to secure the necessary materials. Under this grim scenario, the compliance of the victims becomes clear. They followed the checklist precisely because they trusted their guide. They arrived at the determined location at 4:30 p.m., put on the raincoats to shield themselves from the weather, and at 18:30 they swallowed the capsules provided to them, believing it was a specialized compound to elevate their psychic senses. They placed the lead masks over their eyes, blinding themselves in anticipation of the great cosmic signal. As they lay there waiting in total darkness, the substance took effect, paralyzing their nervous systems and stopping their hearts. The perpetrator then simply walked out from the shadows, reached into their suits, extracted the 2.3 million cruzeros, and left them to rot on the hillside, their faces hidden behind plates of lead. The primary suspect for this theory was Elcio Gomez, the third technician who had participated in the backyard radio experiments in Campos. Gomes was arrested and brought into the Niteroi police station for intense, multi-day interrogations. He admitted that he shared their obsession with the unknown, and he acknowledged that they had spoken about finding a way to supercharge their contact experiments. However, Gomes maintained his absolute innocence regarding their deaths. He provided a rock-solid alibi, proving he was miles away in Campos during the 72 hours in question. Despite checking his financial records and searching his property, detectives could find no trace of the missing 2.3 million cruzeros, nor any physical evidence connecting him to the clearing on Vintém Hill. With no concrete proof, the state was forced to release him. As the months stretched into years, the case officially grew cold. The public moved on to other sensations, and the file was placed into the archives of unsolved anomalies. But the analytical fascination with the evidence never truly died. Decades later, in the early 1980s, a new generation of investigators and forensic scientists decided to reopen the lead masks file, determined to apply modern scientific breakthroughs to the old ghosts of Niteroi. The Brazilian government authorized an extraordinary measure: the exhumation of the remains of Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz. The primary goal of the exhumation was to test a theory that had persisted in the scientific community for years: the possibility of radiation poisoning. Given that the men were advanced electronic technicians who built experimental equipment, and given the bizarre inclusion of lead masks, some researchers hypothesized that they had managed to source or create a highly radioactive material. Lead is the universal shield against gamma radiation. It was entirely possible that they were trying to protect their optic nerves from a lethal dose of radioactive energy generated by their own machinery. The bones were carefully removed from their graves and subjected to state-of-the-art radiological tracking and advanced bone density toxicology. But once again, Vintém Hill refused to give up its secrets. The laboratory reports confirmed that there were no abnormal levels of radiation present in the skeletal remains. The bones were completely normal. Any chemical signature of an exotic toxin or unknown drug had long since been reclaimed by the Earth, leaving investigators with the exact same blank slate that faced the police in 1966. To truly understand what transpired on that ledge, modern behavioral psychologists and historical researchers have shifted their focus away from the physical bodies and toward the specific cultural movements of the era. The mid-20th century in South America saw the rise of highly organized scientific spiritualist groups that operated almost like secret societies. These organizations did not view spiritualism as a mystical religion, but as a hard science that had yet to be fully mapped by mainstream academia. Within these groups, sensory deprivation was a known methodology used to force the brain to bypass normal physical inputs. By cutting off sight with heavy metal masks, minimizing sound in an isolated environment, and using chemical compounds to alter brain chemistry, an individual could theoretically force their consciousness to perceive frequencies that are normally filtered out by human biology. The instructions to protect metals also align perfectly with these esoteric protocols. Many spiritualist manifestos of the time explicitly stated that personal metallic objects like watches, coins, and keys carried local magnetic fields that could interfere with cosmic energy transmissions or cause dangerous electrical arcing during a spiritual transition. By setting their money and electronic gear aside, or by seeking to ground themselves, Miguel and Manuel were simply following the technical safety manual of their belief system. The tragedy of the case lies in the terrifying ambiguity that remains. Every single piece of evidence balances perfectly on a knife's edge between a brilliant, cold-blooded murder and a fanatical, self-inflicted scientific accident. The neat suits and matching raincoats point to a highly organized, intentional appointment. The lead masks point to an absolute, unshakable faith in a reality beyond our own. The cryptic notebook checklist shows a level of calculation that borders on military precision. And the completely inconclusive autopsy ensures that the final, definitive answer remains locked away in the quiet earth of the mountain. Today, Morro do Vintém has been heavily altered by the inexorable march of urban sprawl. The city of Niterói has expanded upward, and parts of the old mountain paths are now bordered by residential neighborhoods and modern infrastructure. The thick wild brush where young Jorge da Costa Alves searched for his lost kite has been cleared away, but the ledge remains, looking out over the expanse of water of the bay. For historians of crime, for forensic researchers, and for those who look toward the night sky wondering about our place in the cosmos, Vintém Hill stands as a grim monument to the limits of human understanding. Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz climbed that mountain in absolute certainty that they were about to receive a signal from the unknown. They put on their masks, closed their eyes, and stepped into a silence that no amount of human analysis has ever been able to break. The case files remain open in the police archives, the crude lead plates sit silently in a forensic museum, and the true events of that dark, rainy August night continue to drift away, forever lost in the heavy mist of the mountain.